Now, the next thing I want to talk about briefly is choosing the theme based on the learning curve associated with using it. And I'd like to suggest an analogy. I don't mean this analogy to be pejorative because it shouldn't be construed to be that way. But, this is an analogy really between a flip phone and a smartphone. It doesn't take you very long to learn how to use a flip phone because it doesn't do very much, right? You can send some text, you can answer the phone, you can take a couple pictures. And that's about the size of what you can do with a flip phone. And so since there's not a lot you can do with your flip phone, it doesn't really take very long to use it, to learn how to use it. On the other hand, a smartphone can just about do anything. And so any new thing you want to do with your smartphone means you're going to have to learn something new. And so the learning curve for a smartphone is considerably larger than the learning curve for a flip phone. Well, that analogy I think is I don't know, it's instructive in some way between Genesis and Thesis. Because for most Genesis users, the typical Genesis user, the number of changes that the typical Genesis user can make are very limited. And therefore, the learning curve is much shorter. Remember what I said at the very beginning, that a beginner can end up with a very polished looking site very quickly with Genesis because you start with a very polished skin and you make a few very minor changes to it, you add your content to it, and you have a polished looking website. The learning curve in that case is quite short. However, if you're not the typical Genesis user but you're a web designer, then you're going to need to learn HTML, CSS, PHP, maybe even some JavaScript in order to effectively customize Genesis. And since that's the case, the learning curve is actually pretty long. Now, you can do anything you want with Genesis when you know that stuff, right? Anything Thesis can do, Genesis can do, because it still comes down to PHP code and HTML structures. And so there's no reason why you can't accomplish any design in Thesis any design in Genesis that you can accomplish in Thesis. It's just that in Thesis you're not writing code, and in Genesis you are. And therefore you have a relatively longer learning curve, I think, in Genesis if you are going beyond sort of the typical use of a child theme. Now, in Thesis, if you are a typical user, you can make a ton of changes without ever really having to think about the code, and the learning curve is much shorter. Now, there's a downside to this. And the downside to this is that you get sucked into wanting to make more changes, right? If you're working in Genesis and the red color that you choose for the skin is pretty close to what you want and it works, you're going to stick with it. But in Thesis, you don't have to stick with that red color. So maybe then you say, well, maybe I want this one to be a slightly different shade of red. Well, you don't have that choice in Genesis, so you don't have to worry about it. But you do have that choice in Thesis. And so you do get sucked into iterative design where you say, well, what does it look like with this? Well, what would it look like with that? Well, what might look with this? And that is not necessarily always a good thing, right? Because you get sucked into having to learn more because the stuff you don't know how to do is already pretty easy, right? And so the typical user doesn't need to know very much, but definitely gets led to attempt to learn more because all of a sudden they imagine the possibility of making a change that somebody using a Genesis child theme is just not going to imagine. Okay, if you're a web designer, not the typical Thesis user, but if you're a web designer, you really do need to learn HTML concepts and CSS code. Now, like I said, you're almost never going to write HTML, but you do need to have a pretty good understanding of how HTML works. And because you're going to go beyond sort of design settings, you're also going to be writing CSS code. And so you're going to need to become comfortable with CSS code. But you virtually never need PHP. You're seldom going to write HTML, and actually it's quite a bit easier to learn to use Thesis than it is to learn HTML, PHP, CSS, JavaScript. The skill set is much smaller. It's easier to learn. It's easier to figure out than aggregating all of those other coding standards into a single way of working. So in terms of a learning curve, for a web designer, the learning curve typically in Thesis is going to be shorter than the learning curve in Genesis. But for a beginning user, the learning curve is typically going to be shorter in Genesis with a more polished result than it is in Thesis.